Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Baker Institute and Rice University. We are really proud to be joined today by a distinguished diplomat and a personal friend of mine who will be discussing one of the most important recent developments in global affairs. As you know, the Arab awakening has seized the world's attention since January, when a Tunisian vendor set himself on fire, resulting in a successful revolution, a popular revolution, that sparked uprisings across the Middle East, into Egypt, Libya, Syria, Bahrain, and Yemen, and numerous protests in other countries. I've said this at the outset, but I believe we are witnessing a tectonic shift in the political landscape of the Middle East. The Obama administration, I believe, has tactically taken the right course in addressing the political dynamics of change. The administration has stated that what is happening in the Arab world, the quest for individual liberties, human rights, broader political participation, economic and social justice, is what the United States stands for. This is our value system: democracy, human rights. But in terms of our national security interests, I believe we have to differentiate. Each country has to be taken on its own merits. That's wise, I believe, because American foreign policy is very necessarily a balance between our national security interests and our values. Of course, one of the first countries in the region to experience significant unrest was Egypt. And what happens in Egypt will have a very major impact throughout the Arab world because of Egypt's historic and actual weight in the Arab world. We're continuing to see Egypt's people and government work through a transition to a meaningful democracy in their country, despite many obstacles along the way. Also, we've just recently seen the key role that Egypt has played in the prisoner exchange, Gilad Shalit, and the Palestinian prisoners who are exchanged today, a very major development. And Egypt played a very important role, especially in terms of negotiating, I believe. You can tell us what happened with Hamas and the Israelis. When you look at Egypt, the most successful part of our dialogue with the post-Mubarak regime was our intimate ties with the Egyptian military. We used those close ties during the immediate fall of Mubarak to encourage the military in Egypt to be a vehicle of transition to a new political future. So none of these movements in the Arab world are going to be a straight line toward democracy. Some groups or individuals may try to hijack the process, but in the long arc of history, I believe the Middle East has most likely embarked on a better path. We are truly interested to hear what our noted speaker has to say about these issues, these tectonic shifts, and the current situation in Egypt, as well as other major political changes taking place in the Middle East. He is currently, as you can see in your program notes, the founding dean of the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the American University of Cairo. Our speaker has had a very distinguished career. He served as ambassador of Egypt to the United States from 1999 to 2008. It's quite a long time. And Egyptian ambassador to Japan from 1997 to 1999. He was also the political advisor to Egypt's foreign minister. Again, if you look at your notes, he's a career diplomat who's played a very active role in numerous efforts to bring peace to the Middle East. In the summer of 2010, he was gracious enough to host and meet with Rice University students participating in the Baker Institute's Public Diplomacy and Global Policy Making program at the American University of Cairo. The students told me enthusiastically that their meetings were truly productive, very engaging and informative, especially their meetings with you. And I appreciate the time and the effort you took to interact with our Rice students. Our speakers' insights, our students told us that you characterized the relationship between Egypt and the United States as a mature marriage. I don't know if my wife is here, but having just marked Francoise and my 40th wedding anniversary this year, I'm going to stay off the record on that subject. There she is. Okay. Francoise, you came in at the right time because I was just saying how the Rice students who went to the American University of Cairo told me that Ambassador Fahmy described the U.S.-Egyptian relationship as a quote-unquote mature marriage. and that after 40 years of marriage, I'm not going to say anything about that. So please, ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Ambassador Fahmy.
Thank you, Ambassador Georgian. Thank you very much. Before making my substantive comments, Ed never misses the choice of the right words. Not on the issue of mature marriage, I'll get to that. But everywhere I've been going over the last 6 months, especially in the West, they start off by saying Arab Spring. And it always sort of pushes me back. Now, I accept the metaphor. It's a positive metaphor. But we don't have long springs in the Middle East. So the idea that this is going to happen quickly goes against the whole logic of the phrase. And for a couple of months, I was thinking, what term should I use? I mean, it's not enough simply to say it's the wrong term. You have to come up with something better than that. And Arab awakening was the one most frequently used. Since I wasn't the one who came up with it, I didn't choose it. And I sort of chose Arab dawn, but Arab awakening is as close as we can get. And again, you've proven that your choice of words is not only that of a diplomat, but also of a very prestigious academic at the same time. Let me just explain the mature marriage thing before I get into trouble. I've been married just 3 years less than you have. But the reason I said that was I didn't want to get into Catholic Coptic discussions. There are no divorces in Catholic marriages, nor are there in Coptic marriages. But I didn't want to get into religious debate. So my point really was the relationship is so important to America and to Egypt. And when one looks at it, it started off exactly the way marriages start off, with the flirtations right after the 73 war, when Nixon and Kissinger were in office and Sadat was in office. It then got into a rather energetic courting process. And then we had the honeymoon after the Camp David agreements. And then we got a bit bored. And we sort of decided to pick on each other for a while. But as we did that, you wonder, well, we're having a couple of arguments, but is this really something we want to break up or not? And you look at it and you say, we've made too much of an investment here. And actually, over the term of the relationship, it's gone very well. And there's much more in it in continuing it than in not continuing it. And that's what I meant by mature marriage. But now, again, I have to say that for the sake of both not only his marriage, but mine.
You're off the hook.
On what's happening in the Middle East, and first of all, I think what's happening in the Middle East was inevitable. And then let me describe it. Why was it inevitable? It was inevitable because we had I'm talking about the Arab Middle East in particular, although it does spill over into Iran a little bit, even into Israel, but my focus is on the Arab Middle East. You have a population that 50% of which is about 25 years or younger. So it's a very young population. In Egypt alone, 56% are 25 or younger. A population of that kind will always want to push for change, will be anxious, impatient. Add to it that you have a changing connectivity factor where there's a free flow of information, be that through satellite television, an open press generally throughout the Middle East, and then, of course, you can add internet and Facebook and all of that to it. So there is a free flow of information, even among countries that were not Western democracies by any standard. But the information was there. So you're not going to get if you have a young population and you give them all the information you want, and they are by the nature of the beast anxious and want change, you're going to have change. Now, how much change, what kind of change, when is the change, that's really the issue. It wasn't And the fact that we did not see it, at least most of us didn't see it, was really our fault rather than that it was hidden. Add to that in different degrees, there was, and I'm only going to talk about the political part of it, there was a problem of lack of governance, of good governance, in most of the Arab world. Again, different degrees, different places, but that was a recurrent problem. So you have a problem with the political systems in the Arab world, not because they're not westernized, but because they're not interactive enough with their own people. Again, they're responsible only to their own people, not to be Western democracies. My issue is they weren't interactive enough to their own people. And when I say that, I basically mean the systems were not competitive enough. You can put all the laws you want to theoretically allow for a democratic system or otherwise, but if it's not competitive, it's not democratic, because you're not going to get a change in government and so on and so forth. So divide it up any way you want. If you don't change the people in power, then it's not a democratic system, because people are not choosing, therefore. Now, those were the reasons for the change that occurred. Now, I can add to it that there was a disparity between the rich and the poor. There were, in some countries, not in all, levels of poverty that are simply unacceptable. And you can add corruption and so on and so forth. But it's not sort of the standard problem throughout the Arab Middle East. What is standard, first of all, change has started and will go through all of the Arab countries in the Middle East. The reasons are the two ones I gave at the beginning. How quickly, in what form, what is the result? You'll have a difference between the political problems in each one of these countries, the economic disparities, the wealth, the poverty, the regional issues around them, and so on and so forth. So change was a given, and it's surprising that most of us missed it was going to happen. I talked to some students a few minutes ago, and I said, I saw it 5 years ago. I didn't see it a month before it happened. And I'm being extremely true with you. I actually did make an assessment more than 5 years ago now, that we're going to have a crisis somewhere around 2011. Not a revolution. I had no idea we'd have a revolution. But I didn't see it 1 month before it happened, when I was actually based in Cairo. The change that occurred so far was about politics. That's essentially where the focus was. Even when it happened in Tunis, because of the particular case, Abu Azizi, and his case was he was looking for a better standard of living, but he wanted to be treated in a dignified fashion. It immediately moved into a political issue rather than simply an issue of economics or corruption or so on and so forth. Now, if you add to that a lot of the regimes where change has occurred first in the Arab world have been there for a long time, that on the one hand affirms my point about problems of being of being interconnected with your people, and also, frankly, you become complacent when you stay in the same place for a long time, even if you're doing a good job. So with these factors, this is why you saw the change. Now, what actually has changed is another question. I was born here, not in Houston, but in America. I'm not American, and I never have been. But for different reasons, I was born abroad and traveled quite a large part of my youth. And frankly, one of the things which I found personally challenging was how we treat authority, be that in the family, be that in business, be that professionally where we're working, and of course, politically, vis-a-vis how you treat authority, which is completely different, frankly. what has really changed over the last 6 months in the Arab world is exactly that. It's not the ascension of the Islamists or the removal of Western regimes or the appointment of Western democracies. None of that has really happened yet. What has happened is the relationship between the governed and the governing is different. And let me explain that with a personal anecdote, which I'm not exaggerating on. I've been traveling about 3 days a week for the last 6 months, except for August. And frankly, there was a point in time about 4 months ago where I wasn't exactly sure which day of the week this was when I was back home in Cairo. Because you start traveling, first of all, there are different weekends. And then you travel on the weekend and you're working throughout. So anyway, somebody asked me what day of the week it was, and I just couldn't figure out what day it was. And then I figured it out by listening to the political debate in Cairo. Saturdays, silent. Sundays, you get the first expressions of anger or anxiety or the requests of the week. Monday tends to be a general silence on the part of the government or the military commission, or they give a very low no to the request. Tuesday, you get the second challenge from the demonstrators. Well, unless you take this seriously, we're going to start demonstrating. Wednesday, you have a little bit of commotion. Thursday evening, the government gives in to the requests in order not to have a demonstration on Friday. And when they don't give in, you have the demonstration on Friday. And I literally figured out the day of the week because it was right in the middle of the week when the energy factor behind the demands had increased. The reason I explain this is it shows you that the public today is actually not afraid of challenging authority. And it shows you, as complicated as the situation may be, those in authority, I'm talking about Egypt in particular, be that the military council or the government, is very sensitive to the street. Neither of them is where they should be, but they're both trying to find out this balance between authority, the governed, and the governing. And that's what we're trying to do. Now, so what you're seeing in Egypt and throughout the Arab world is a challenge to the sense of authority. Now, somebody may come up and say, but in Morocco it's done this way, in Egypt it's this way, in Saudi Arabia they haven't done this yet. Of course. And it will be different. But why did the king of Morocco 3 years ago move very significantly on the rights of women, and in a positive sense? Why did we have revolutions in Tunis and Egypt and then Libya? Why suddenly are the Saudis talking about women participating in voting? And why are you having the questions in Yemen and Syria all at the same time? Now, one of the theories back home, it's an American plot, but I don't give you that much credit, frankly. So I actually argue that it's because of the reasons that I shared with you, and it's also because of this awakening among Arabs that they have to participate in determining their own future. And in the search of the authority in the Arab world, how do we deal with this? Now, the challenge is, how do you deal with it without giving up power if you haven't given up power yet? And how do you deal with it in a fashion where it's inclusive for the future if you've already given up power, which is the case in most respects in Tunis and Egypt? The political forces in the Arab world now, Egypt being the particular example, are basically divided between the ideologues, mostly looked at in the West as the Islamists, but I would add to them the pure leftists, the Naserites, and so on and so forth, anybody who is a true believer in whatever he believes in, irrespective of whether I think it's right or wrong, because they're not going to change their opinions simply because there's a better argument. That's a matter of belief or conviction. Then you have a sector that is the remnants of the old systems. And I'm not arguing, by the way, that they're all bad. If you've had systems that have been there for 30, 40 years, then ultimately you cannot say that 2 generations of people were all bad. But you can disqualify some who were very close or did particularly malicious things. So you still will have a sector of people who were in authority in the past. The majority, however, are the undecided, because they never participated in the political process in the past. And the real challenge in the Middle East today, especially in Egypt, is how do you get and where do the undecided go? Do they join religious movements? Do they become secular movements? Are they secular with a Western bent? Are they secular with an Oriental, if you want, bent? What is the different formulas? In that context, we have to develop an election law. We, for example, in Egypt have taken the German law as the system of election for parliament, which is a very complicated law based on a voting participation of almost 100%. Our voting participation in the past never went beyond single digits. But it's at least they've taken this law and tried to amend it. We have to develop a constitution. Develop a new constitution to take into account today's reality, which involves not only the actual letter of the Constitution, but also the spirit of the Constitution. It has to come up and become an inclusive Constitution with recognized rights and responsibilities and accountability for the President and for the government vis-à-vis the Parliament and the people. And it has to deal with issues that are typical of the Middle East, be that the role of religion in societies or the future role of the military in societies, given that the military has had such a prominent role in the past. We have to do all of that when, whether it's in Tunis or in Egypt, or for that matter, if I'm not mistaken, and Ed, if I am, please correct me, in Yemen, even in Syria, these are all revolutions or revolutions in the making without leaders. There's no head. There's no traditional leader who is, I'm the leader. There's no Mandela here. These are all grassroots revolutions that have not yet chosen their leader. So they have to choose the nature of their state, make up with the past, and move forward without leadership, which is a daunting task by any standard. For me, and I will then get into some of the issues in a bit more detail, for me the success or failure in Egypt in particular, and I would assume the same applies to most of the Arab countries, although it may differ from one or the other because of the different composition of their people. The success or failure will ultimately be dependent on voter participation in the elections for parliament. I say this because if we get a voter participation that reflects society, that includes the ideologues and the silent majority that didn't participate in the voting in the past, you will get a result that is inclusive, that is secular, that has religious factors or sectors in there, and that is respectful of the opinion of the majority and the rights of the minority. That's what you saw during the demonstrations. Everybody was out there, irrespective of who was larger in number or smaller in number. They were all out there. They were clearly the more powerful and the less powerful, but it wasn't at the expense of the rights of either side. Minorities in the vote, I'm not talking about minorities in society, will have to accept that whoever gets the majority is going to decide how the country is ruled. But whoever gets the majority will have to also respect that even though they've gotten the majority, the minority still has equal rights to them. It's a political difference, not a difference in rights and responsibilities. Now, how do you do all that in the absence of leadership is a challenge. If we fall back to the old political parties, then we're in trouble. If, on the other hand, you have a wide voter participation, and I mentioned just a few minutes ago, for me, wide, given Egyptian standards, would be anywhere from 55 to 65% of those eligible to vote. Then I think we will get a result that is successful enough for Parliament, and that's the important point for me, because it's the Parliament that then chooses the Constitutional Commission, which develops the new constitution. I'm not worried, frankly, who will elect for president 5 or 6 months later. I wouldn't say that 5 or 6 months from now, but I mean, presently, that's not what concerns me. I believe we have about 12, maybe 15 candidates for president. I can rule out, I think, easily, at least 10 of them. And 3 out of the remaining 5, I would have no problem whatsoever voting for any of them, because they would, at the end of the day, keep Egypt at the center of the political system. But it's really what happens in Parliament that's more important to me. Now, what are the options for Parliament? If you have the right participation, we're going to get a coalition government. There's no way we're going to get a majority government with a large participation in the elections. I'd expect you'd get a coalition government, which is going to be difficult to manage, but at the end of the day can carry you through the transition process. That coalition government will include Islamists, but would not necessarily be led by an Islamist or an ideological movement. If you get low participation in government, you may get a majority of low participation in voting, you may get a majority, but it will be a majority of the ideologues. And that's, frankly, something that would worry me considerably. As of now, I am anxious that it's taken us so long. I am anxious that there hasn't been enough clarity and vision in terms of the process. It's been 8 months. We should have had a clearer roadmap earlier on. We finally have it now, but I'm not pessimistic that we cannot do this. I actually, from a lot of personal things that I've witnessed recently, I see a tremendous enthusiasm by the average Egyptian to actually understand the election law, to understand what are the options in changing the constitution, to understand the difference in the different political positions taken. I also see a lot of political maneuvering. I'll just share with you one point. The election law came out recently, and they did a marvelous job of redistricting a lot of the districts, something you guys would be proud of.
Gerrymandering.
Yeah, it's legal though. And the result of that is that we have 35 or 37 parties now in Egypt. A number of the founders of these new parties have decided to run as independents rather than on their party slates. Now that would not logically, you would not normally expect that, but it just shows you that everybody's looking at, okay, how does this system work? How do we get into ultimately a seat in Parliament? We want to participate. I'm not sure the result is going to be what we want. I'm just raising this point because it reflects an engagement in politics that 15 years ago, people wouldn't be bothered with who's running, who's not running, should they run or not, should I even vote or not vote. That's not the case now. Just one more point or two more points on Egypt, just a very few more points on Egypt, and then I'll just speak a little bit on the region. When all of this was happening, we all attributed to the youth movements, and they deserve tremendous credit. They honestly do. And I met with them as part of what people like to call a wise men's group, although that was not our choice of words. And I can tell you, if I could hand over Egypt to these kids, I'd rest, I'd sleep very comfortably. They were smart, wise, insightful kids that are responsible and extremely patriotic. But they came to us basically saying, okay, we removed the regime, help us rebuild it, because we don't know how to build a nation. And that's really where the challenge is. How do you bring the experiences of society and the engagement of society to the enthusiasm and energy of the youth movements? And these are kids who know that they don't know how to build a nation. So they're actually much wiser than one would assume. My problem is, frankly, I'm not sure we know how to build it. So because we haven't done this in the past through a political system. We've done it in the past through a system that had a very strong central government, which is a different process. That being said, I get phone calls all hours of the day and night from people who were never politically oriented, asking in the middle of the night about Article 21 of the Constitution, or Article 27, and what's the difference between this party and that party. And as much as it annoys me to be getting these phone calls, as much as it really is a source of enthusiasm that Egyptians continue to be thinking about these things and debating them. There's a big question about, okay, where does the old system go? Be that the older politicians or be that the military and so on. And it's a valid question because we were all there for years. Most of us are still there, and we all share in being part of this country. Let me address the issue of the military for a second. The military, during the demonstrations, did an admirable job. They managed the country without using force intentionally against anyone. And by any standard, frankly, it was something we were all proud of. They were not trained in nation building. So what happened, and particularly in a nation that is developing an open political system, so frankly, they haven't done as well afterwards, partially because they didn't know what to do, and partially because they're listening to so many different opinions, which is what they should be doing. And ultimately, I suppose also they're thinking about what is their role in the future. I still believe that the military will hand over power to the next president without any serious strife. The question is how much power it hands over, or doesn't, between the elections of parliament and that for president. That's really the question. Had we had the two elections back to back, this wouldn't really be an issue. But if you're having them for 6 months difference between the two, because you're putting together the Constitution, one has to think about what do you do in the transition period. They have repeatedly said they will leave as soon as the president is elected. I truly believe they will leave. Will we have to find a way for them to leave comfortably? I'm sure we will. But I honestly believe if we do this properly, whatever arrangements are reached with the military, they will really become almost irrelevant if we have a full-fledged functioning political system within the next 5 or 7 years that is functioning effectively. And I give you the Turkish example, but also the Brazilian example. And people always look at Turkey because it's closer to the region. And they always forget that the Turkish model now isn't what it was at the beginning of the process. But if you look at the Brazilian model, it's even more complicated than the Turkish model. But nobody knows about the details because they have moved into a full-fledged democracy, and therefore nobody would think of using whatever authority the military actually can use in Brazil. It is a functioning democracy. And this, I was told this by former Brazilian officials who said, if you can establish the system of government, it's not really that important, the compromise you make with the military at this point, as long as they're serious about engaging in this. The other issue is the role of religion in society. We are going to debate this over and over and over again. But we're debating it openly, and that's healthy. Any of you who want to come and argue that religion will not have a place in politics in the Middle East can waste your time. Even in Israel, which is a democracy, it's not a secular state, religion will be part of politics in Egypt. I have no problem with that. But I don't want politics to be part of religion. I don't mind if somebody wants to bring his values to the ballot box. Or even to, sorry, it's the other way around. I don't want religion to be defining politics. I don't have a problem with religious people expressing their opinions. My concern really is we will have to find a way for all to get engaged. But you cannot define the success or failure of politics based on your religious beliefs one way or the other. And I'll just take you back to one point, and then I want to jump quickly into some foreign policy issues that relate to. Okay. In Egypt, our best constitution is a constitution that was drafted back in 1923. That was drafted by a committee that included Christians and Jews. And it actually had the strongest reference that Islam is the religion of the state. But it didn't bother them at all. Because the environment at that point in time in Egypt would not have interpreted that to mean it's at the expense of the non-Muslims. The language on religion after that is actually much weaker, but it's much more troublesome, not only for non-Muslims, even for somebody like me. Because then the polarization that exists now takes that a little bit too far beyond the actual meaning of a narrative of what the state is to the rights and responsibilities of its participants. So we're going to have to address this, but again, as I said, if we have large voter participation, I think we will come out with a positive result on this. Quick words on what this will mean for foreign policy. And I've intentionally put that at the end because the first part of this is much more important to me and I think to you than what our foreign policy is in the short term vis-a-vis any particular issue. And I'll say this in sort of bullet points. One, whether we go for a secular system or an Islamist system, there's no socialism in Islam. So the idea that we will go into a socialist, a closed system is inconsistent, economically at least, with even our own religion. Secondly, if the debate even up till now in Egypt on the regional issues, only one candidate has come out and said, I want to review the Camp David agreement with the Israelis. And he hasn't even said, I want to revoke it. He's only said, I want to review it. So most of the political parties in Egypt and most of the candidates for president, the farthest they go is maybe we'll review the agreement. Nobody has said, let's revoke. It's part of our history, whether you like it or you don't like it. It should be reviewed in its security annex. But it's not reviewing the end of conflict part of it or the peace engagement part of it. But yes, the security annex does need review. Otherwise, you cannot secure the border on both sides. Vis-a-vis the U.S., not once was foreign policy raised during the demonstrations, nor was, frankly, and I say this with all due respect to all of you, you weren't mentioned. I used to be the Egyptian ambassador to the United States, and I was in all of these committees. Nobody came to me and said, what's the U.S.? What the U.S. think? And it surprised me. At the end of the demonstrations, we reflected on, well, what was the difference between the secretary and the president at a certain date in the discussions? What exactly was Frank Wisner carrying? What kind of message was he carrying? And so on and so forth. But this was not about America. This was a domestic issue. And I actually think that you will have a more vigorous foreign policy that's more straightforward, more short-term, as well as being more strategic. We've always had a strategic foreign policy. We were less active on the short-term consequences because you didn't have to react to the constituency in the street. Well, any new government will have to react to the constituency in the street. It will not serve, for Egypt to grow and expand, we need to have good relations, well-managed relations with the U.S. now and in the future. And I see that being the case. Now, yes, if you decide to go into Iraq again, or, I know you're not going to, but if you would, or if you are not supportive of the Arab-Israeli peace process, Egyptians will get angry. And the Egyptian government will have to find a way to balance out between these two things. But in terms of the long-term interests of Egypt, having a good relationship with the U.S. is important. Same thing applies to the Israelis. If they want to pursue peace in the Middle East, you will have a responsive Egyptian government. And Ed just mentioned, in spite of all of what's happening now, in the middle of all of this, and in spite of the fact that we had a border clash not between Egyptians and Israelis, but between infiltrators and Israelis, which ended up in 5 Egyptians getting killed, the government did not move away from the relationship and continued to work on the Shalit deal until you got the prisoner exchange. So I'm not concerned about our strategic objectives vis-a-vis peace in the Middle East, including with Israel, with the U.S. Pushing moderation in the Middle East, looking at a new relationship with the Nile Basin countries, and adding what I see different, however, are 2 things. One, there will be, like in all democracies, short-term consequences to our actions and events. I used to be called in by young congressmen all the time in Washington whenever they found something that bothered a particular influential member of their constituency. Well, your ambassador may also be called in when these things happen. That's part of democracy. The other thing I actually see, while we will not be proponents of regime change anytime in the near future, I actually also believe that you will see more of a valued-based foreign policy in years to come, especially if we elect a parliament that is representative of society. Let me just stop with these comments, and again, I'm happy to answer any questions well beyond what I've mentioned. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nabil. Thank you for that in-depth presentation that only you could give. The floor is now open for questions. Yes.
Yes. Mr. Ambassador, I think you very eloquently explained the political situation. Many of the reasons that stimulated this group in the first place are economics. Disparity of wealth, lack of jobs, lack of opportunity. Most people realize that those economic changes have been slow in coming, and that it's going to take years to implement policies that seriously bring about and address these problems. My question is, how long is this group going to be able to sit back and wait for these changes, which I think would not create a stable government or allow a government to be stable? What kind of economic progress is necessary? How is that implemented to be able to allow a stable government to continue in these countries?
Well, my immediate reaction to that is there's no quick response, as you just mentioned. To change the economic situation, it's going to take time. So to get people to wait a while, you, on the one hand, have to make them stakeholders in the process. And I think the success of the political process will allow people or encourage people to say, well, okay, we're working on this together. We're partners in this process, so maybe we give each other a little bit more time to achieve that. Now, that's not going to be open-ended. We will need a strong influx of cash to deal with a liquidity crunch that's going to hit in the next 2 to 3 months at most. The Egyptian government, the present government or the newly elected government, will have to focus on employment-heavy investments in the immediate term, short and medium-sized projects, large infrastructural projects, where they can employ more people more quickly. And hopefully, if we get some vision into the process, we can get tourism back up, because as much as we are going to target investments from day one have an effect 2 or 3 years down the line, significant effect. But tourism, the minute you get some people coming back, that immediately brings in a quick flow of money, and it's also an employment-heavy position. So I agree with you, it's going to be a problem. We have to have the right policies, but it's going to take time, and therefore you have to couple the right policies with political engagement and people believing in this is their system, not a system that's being imposed on them.
Question from the students? You're not a student, but anyway, you.
Already go ahead.
I'm a lifelong student. I learn it. I want to focus on the relations between Egypt and Israel again. When you say review the peace accord, do you mean the paragraph in the peace accord that limits very much the forces, Egyptian forces in the Sinai? Because I think Israel may look differently now on that in light of the recent occurrences in Sinai. And I have a feeling that the whole peace accord was more a movement that comes from the top. There was no undercurrent or populist undercurrent that wanted peace with Israel. Now that, as you say, elections will have a very wide base of voting percentages, maybe a popular movement will be against the peace accord altogether. I mean, when what you said is that nobody in Egypt in government is talking about revoking it, but maybe if another parliament will come into being, there will be more other currents there. What do you think about that? And in light also of what happened to the Israeli embassy in Cairo in recent times, in recent weeks?
Sure. First of all, what I was referring to and what I support is a review of the Security Annex. The Security Annex was based on concerns that existed 30 years ago when we were still at war with each other and were just starting the process of peace. It was also based on the presence of Israel on the other side of the border. So when the package was reached where we'd have, whatever it was, 10 jeeps, 1 helicopter ride a week in one region of the Sinai, it was based on the Israelis being on the other side. Well, in some cases, they're not there any longer. So there's no way, in Gaza, for example, they're not there. They've withdrawn from Gaza. So there's no way you can control the 14-kilometer strip with the kind of limitations you had in the past. We do anyway. And how do we do that? By phoning the Israelis and saying, we're going to send up 500 more people. And every single time we do, they say yes. So they say yes because they understand this is not because we want to attack Israel. It's because there's a new security paradigm. Over and above that, it was at the time a state-to-state issue. Now the security issues are about infiltrators, not about state-to-state issues. So that's what I meant by it serves Israel and Egypt to review that.
I'm aware of that.
Exactly. So I don't think we differ on that. In terms of the popular movement being against the peace process, look, can it happen? Sure, it can happen. It can happen in Israel as well. But is it probable to happen? No. It was not, and the reason I say that is two things. One, on issues of war and peace, it's never the population. It's always the leadership. whether it was relations with China, whether it was the Vietnam War, whether it was Arab-Israeli peace, it was always the leaders who led the people. It wasn't a grassroots movement that changes it. But let me address the point more clearly. My Israeli friends, in the middle of the demonstrations, we all have Israeli friends. They phone me and say, what can we do? You just stay out of it. You don't want to get into this debate. If you want to get in the middle of a populist debate, it's not going to be a debate that you're going to like. They haven't mentioned Israel. You should be happy with that. Let us get our stuff done. We'll get into this since then. Frankly, the case of the embassy is a case in point. It's the mishandling of the case by both sides. The Israelis shot 5 officers or soldiers on the Egyptian side of the border. I won't get into the details of how and why they were shot. There can be circumstances. But they were 5, and they were on the other side of the border. And nobody was questioning that they were from Israeli bullets. The debate was, what was the circumstance around it? Well, if I was an Israeli, I would come out very quickly and say, I apologize. No, it didn't. Hold on. It did not. It said it regretted it. And then Barak said, I did not apologize. I expressed regret. And then, this last week, with the Shalit deal, they apologized in written form. That was the Israeli mistake. Look, whether you like it or not, you shot across the border. The Egyptian side did equally wrong. I'm not saying this is only the Israeli mistake. After a revolution, you cannot not speak to the people. You have to tell the people, this is what happened. We are investigating. We will investigate with the Israelis, and we'll come back to you and tell you what happened. We didn't say that. So I'm not putting the blame only on the Israeli side. When nothing happened, demonstrators said we're going to go and demonstrate in front of the building, the embassy. Well, they went there. What did they find? A wall on the middle of the bridge. Well, if you're not talking to them and you build a wall, what do you think they're going to do? They tore down the wall. I'm not justifying this. Hold on. Then they went in and up to the embassy, which is unacceptable anytime, any standards, no explanations given. It's unacceptable. But what was the Egyptian government doing at the same time?
Sending troops there.
They were inside the embassy. They took out all this Israeli security personnel and took them to the airport. And Prime Minister Netanyahu thanked them for that. All I'm saying here is that this could have been handled better by both the Israelis and the Egyptians. Had we done that, this would never have happened in the entry of the embassy. And we need to do that better in the future, because when you have open societies on both sides, the short-term reaction of the people is important, over and above the fact that our government and the Israeli government, I believe, will continue to preserve peace because it serves the interests of both sides. So will there be tensions? Yes, but it's not. I don't think it's a threatening situation to the peace agreement. In the back there.
Thanks for your talk this evening.
Could you speak up, please?
Yes, the Arab world, the United States, has borders 12,247 kilometers, but the Arabs have 53,678 kilometers. Not a single kilometer was drawn by Arabs. It was all by colonial powers, the British, the French, the Italian, and now the Americans enforcing those borders and adding new borders to what it is. And the Arabs are really fed up with Western colonial powers. And what is going on is not really awakening. They were awakened, the Arabs were awakened immediately after the fall of the Ottoman Turkish Empire. There were revolutions in the 20s and the 30s, in the 40s and 50s, and they got rid of the British, the French, the Italians, and the Americans have taken the place. And what happened in Tunisia by Mohammed Bouazizi, it was really the straw that broke the camel's back. but the Arabs have been awakened long ago. And I can't believe that you call this awakening another revolution, because this will not stop until the Arabs have a complete liberty, freedom, and justice for the Arab people. And I'd really like to have your comments on it. Thank you.
Sure. Well, first of all, you can be awakened more than once. But I take your point seriously. I personally believe that we've already seen a societal revolution, because we're changing the way we think and the way we treat each other. But since I am now an academic, and since we're in an academic environment, definitions of revolution get a bit more complicated, and people want to see the ultimate result before they define whether this is a successful revolution or not. So in the political sense, I'd say it is a revolution, frankly. In the formal sense, I want to still wait and see how far it goes. I mentioned that I use the word Arab dawn because I see something new, and I'm not exactly sure what's going to happen tomorrow and the day after and where we go. So I don't actually see this. My only difference with you, frankly, is I don't challenge that most of the borders were drawn by drunk French and British. But they weren't drunk? Okay.
Unfortunately, they were very sober, but they didn't know what they were doing.
Well, and whatever. Anyway, well, the only difference I have with you on this is actually most of what's happening here was, and I say this, and I am an Arab who has been in government for many, many years, this was mostly against us. It wasn't because the faults of the West. We made our own mistakes. And to actually progress, we have to recognize we made our own mistakes. Were they under pressure, under incentives? All of that is possible. At the end of the day, we need to correct ourselves by ourselves, irrespective of whether it serves America or doesn't serve America. That's my only difference with you on this point. But I understand the importance of what you see in what's happening, and I agree with you on that.
Warren? Okay. No, we have a lot of people. Please, Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I'd like to ask you, who are the framers of your upcoming Constitution, your new Constitution? How were they selected, and what is the process of ratification, please?
The members of the Constitutional Commission will be nominated by Parliament, but have to be endorsed by the Military Council. And let me just explain behind it, because it's a very good question. Lots of the secularists have been arguing, let's postpone the election for Parliament until we give a chance to the young parties to get their feet wet and get a momentum. Otherwise, you're going to elect the old parties and the ideologues. Other people are saying, we don't want the military to continue, so let's get the election done. As a compromise, the Military Commission said, we will guarantee you, the secularists, that the Commission for the Constitution will not simply be a reflection of the Parliament. It will represent society. So we will guarantee you that if the Parliament comes out to be too biased towards one direction or the other, we will engage in establishing the Commission with Parliament to have it represent all sectors of society. That's the compromise we've reached so far. It's not an easy compromise, but that's where it is. It then has to be put to a referendum.
In the new Parliament or to the voters?
Both. It has to be endorsed by Parliament, and then it goes to a public referendum.
Is it up or down in your Parliament, or is it subject to amendment?
Haven't decided yet. It's up and down in the public. Whether it's up and down in Parliament, frankly, I don't know.
Thank you.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Mr. Ambassador, if one accepts, I'm not asking you to, but if one accepts the word of the Attorney General of the United States and President Obama himself, that there was an Iranian hand behind the assassination attempt on the Saudi ambassador, in your experience, nobody seems to be able to, and the experts are now put it in the press, nobody seems to come up with a motivation. What could be in your mind, what could be the motivation for an Iranian attempt of this sort in the United States?
This is beyond your brief.
It's beyond what I could even imagine, frankly. I just simply can't understand and can't envisage how this would at all be useful for Iran, and therefore doubt very much it was a policy decision. I'm not questioning at this point, I don't have the information, whether it was initiated in Iran or not. But if you're going to go and try to assassinate an ambassador anywhere in the world, and particularly in the United States, you're not going to transfer $100,000, whatever it was, from your own bank accounts in your own country to a car salesman and ask him to go and kill somebody. It just looks so stupid that even if they wanted to do this, they could find a better way to do it. So I don't know. And I frankly don't see how it serves Iran. There is an ongoing tension, and tension is an understatement, between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But how does this serve your interest by going and trying to kill the Saudi ambassador? And why in the world would you do this in the middle of an Arab Spring or an Arab uprising or Arab awakening, when you probably want to stand on the side of the good side of the Arabs rather than on the bad side? And attacking an Arab, whoever it may be, is not going to get you on the right side of this debate. So I'm not saying that what the U.S. has said is wrong. I don't have any information. But if this is a true case of a policy decision, I've never seen a worse one in my life.
Ambassador Fahmy, he has a very vested interest in this since he was the American ambassador to Saudi Arabia. But it's not reciprocity. Don't worry.
We haven't seen each other in a long time. We're so glad that you're here.
My pleasure, sir. Thank you.
I think I'm going to have to close it off. We have one more question. Where?
A student.
Student, finally.
Okay, Mr. Ambassador, I'm Egyptian, so the internal politics of Egypt really bothers me. So from day one, as you said, in the revolution, the army took the side of the people, and they said that they saved the revolution. No one knows from what. Right now, you also said that the percentage of participation in the parliamentary elections is very important, and even at the same time, we don't see any real steps of allowing Egyptians abroad to elect. And we're not talking about a small number, we're talking about around, according to the figures, around 8 million. And the second thing is the presidential elections. According to the constitutional referendum that was in March, it said that after the election of of the parliament, they will open the door to elect the president while doing the constitution. Why the change in your opinion? Why they changed their opinion right now? Isn't that against the constitution that they gave to the people?
These are great questions. Let me address them directly and quickly. Even when I was ambassador in Washington, I spoke out saying we should allow Egyptians abroad to vote. And the Egyptian government told me that's not our policy. And I said, I know, but I'm going to say it again if you ask me again. I still believe it is the right of Egyptians abroad to vote. If there is, and I've said that to the Military Commission back home, if there is a technical problem with getting them to vote in the parliamentary elections because they're small constituencies, I see no problem with them voting for elections for president. And ask for it, demand it. I will support you back home. This is ridiculous. You should be able to vote. I have no hesitation in saying that. On the issue of sequencing of the elections for president, it's a very complicated issue. People of tremendous integrity, like Mohammed Baradei, for example, has said he will not run for president unless the constitution is finished first, because he needs to know the job description he's running for. At the same time, others have said let's get it done and have the elections for president first. And the third party has said, let's do it in parallel. I mean, how can you actually run for an election while you're doing the Constitution at the same time? How can I judge the guy if I don't know whether he's going to be similar to the Austrian president or the American president? Two completely different functions. So I frankly voted no against the constitutional amendments 5 months ago because I didn't think that they were the right thing to do. So I don't support doing them in parallel because you can't judge people if you don't know what you're doing. I would have been ready, however, to elect a president more quickly based on a constitutional declaration of a limited number of provisions which would define the rights of the president for a period of time until we develop a constitution in order to move it forward. According to the military, they're trying to find a compromise between the extreme liberals and the medium liberals and those who want to get this done. I think the military, again, has done a relatively good job, a very good job at the beginning, a reasonable job in the middle, and there's a diminishing curve here in terms of how effective they've become. And the longer it takes to get this done, the more they will be under criticism. And the more people will wonder, is there an agenda behind this or not? I can't give you an answer. I have not talked to them about this particular issue, but I know from talking to others that the 7 main candidates for president have differed on this specific issue in particular. Thank you.
Join me in thanking Ambassador Fahmy for an excellent presentation.